On the night of December 16th, at 5:20 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, German artillery shattered the silence of the Ardennes forest between Luxembourg and Belgium. At the same time, several V-1 missiles were launched toward the cities of Liège and Brussels. German gunners set the fuses so that the shells would explode high in the treetops, showering shrapnel and splinters down onto the enemy soldiers. The American troops were caught completely by surprise because they believed the enemy was already beaten and that this was a quiet sector to fire. But this German attack was born out of desperation. Since the Allied landings in Normandy 6 months earlier, the German army had done nothing but retreat on the Western Front, pushed back all the way to the borders of the Reich itself. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army had reached the Vistula River, less than 350 miles from Berlin. Germany was being squeezed from both sides, and it seemed only a matter of time before it lost the war. Even so, Hitler planned one last major offensive to try to change the situation. In September 1944, he ordered preparations for a massive attack through the Ardennes, aimed at the port of Antwerp, which was vital for the Allies. His idea was to launch an armored blow that would smash US forces, cross the Meuse, drive on Antwerp, and trap the British and Canadians. He believed that would force the Allied leaders to negotiate and allow him to concentrate on the Eastern Front. To achieve this, 3 German armies, about 400,000 men organized into 30 divisions, would attack along a front of roughly 60 kilometers. The spearhead of the offensive would be the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies, whose armored units were supposed to cross the Meuse in 2 days and capture Antwerp a few days after that. The German generals themselves did not believe the plan could succeed, but the High Command was convinced that the outcome of the war depended on this operation and that it had to be attempted, no matter the cost. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army, under General Sepp Dietrich, had the shortest route to the Meuse and had been given 60% of the operation's tanks. At the very tip of the advance was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a powerful SS armored battle group led by Joachim Peiper and made up of veterans of the Eastern Front. Hitler had personally selected this formation, and its men were expected to be the first to cross the Meuse. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, was to capture the towns of Saint-Vith and Bastogne, 2 road hubs essential for the German advance. Their paved roads would allow the tanks of the Panzer Lehr, 2nd Panzer, and 116th Panzer divisions to drive very rapidly toward the Meuse. The southern part of the attack was considered less important, and the 7th Army, under General Erich Brandenberger, was assigned mainly to cover the flank of the advance. When the German bombardment began, the Allied soldiers at Lanzerath dove into their trenches while the tank destroyers pulled back, rumbling past them without any warning. Soon, the Allied troops saw an entire regiment of German paratroopers moving up the hill toward them in column. They prepared an ambush, but just as they were about to open fire, a young girl ran toward the Germans and pointed out the Americans' position. The paratroopers immediately threw themselves to the ground, and a fierce firefight erupted. Lieutenant Lyle Buch Jr. repeatedly called for artillery support over the radio, but the guns never came to their aid. Even so, Buch's small group held their ground against wave after wave of German attacks. Facing the German forces was a mix of American units. In the north were the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, made up of relatively inexperienced soldiers who had been sent to the Ardennes to learn the ropes gradually. Farther south were the 4th and 28th Infantry Divisions, veteran formations badly mauled by the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen forest. They had been moved to this quiet sector to recover from their heavy losses. All of these units belonged to General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps, whose troops were spread very thin along the front. The 2nd Infantry Division and elements of the 9th Armored Division were also in the area. The Allies had made serious mistakes in their preparations, and their intelligence services had failed to detect the German buildup in time. But what hurt them most was overconfidence. Within the Allied High Command, the belief had taken hold that victory was already assured and that the Third Reich was on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Bulge and his men continued to defend their position against an enemy that outnumbered them 22-1. By nightfall, the German paratroopers had managed to encircle them through the woods and attack from the rear. Even though they were completely outmatched, Bulge's men kept fighting until they ran out of ammunition and were finally captured. Incredibly, his 22 men had managed to hold up a regiment of more than 500 paratroopers for an entire day, inflicting 96 casualties at the cost of just 1 man killed and several wounded. But their most important achievement was delaying the advance of the entire 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte and of Kampfgruppe Piper. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army attacked without any preliminary artillery support, catching the 106th and 28th Infantry Divisions completely off guard. The commander of the 106th Division, Major General Alan W. Jones, almost immediately lost contact with his forward units. There was nothing he could do but sit helplessly in his headquarters at St. Vith, while his division tried to withstand the German assault. In Verdun, the Allied Supreme Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, was celebrating his promotion to 5-star general with General Bradley when they were interrupted by news of the German attack. Bradley thought it was just a small skirmish meant to irritate General George Patton's advance in Lorraine. But the intelligence reports Eisenhower received indicated that the situation was far more serious. Faced with this crisis, Eisenhower made a quick decision. He ordered Patton to halt his offensive and began sending reinforcements from across the Western Front into the Ardennes. His instincts were right. By that afternoon, Allied command understood that this was a major German offensive. Germans were on the verge of breaking through the American lines at several points, but the unexpectedly stubborn resistance of some units was throwing off their timetable. Hitler's insistence that the infantry must first punch holes for the panzers to pass through later was proving to be a mistake. In many sectors, the infantry simply did not have the firepower needed to finish the job. To support the advance on the ground, Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt was ordered to drop 300 paratroopers behind American lines. Their mission was to seize vital road junctions and disrupt Allied supply lines. However, the drops were a disaster. The wind was strong, many of the paratroopers were inexperienced, and anti-aircraft fire was heavy. Some planes did not even release their men and turned back to base. Others dropped them over German-held territory by mistake. When the jumps were over, von der Heydt had managed to gather only about 300 men, and most of them were in no condition to fight effectively. The 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion of the U.S. 7th Armored Division was one of many units Eisenhower had dispatched to the Ardennes. They reached the northern sector of the German attack on the morning of the battle's second day. As the column of trucks approached the village of Ardennes, south of Malmedy, they passed Belgian civilians urgently pointing at the road and shouting, "Bosch! Bosch!" meaning Germans. Unaware of the danger, the American soldiers simply waved back and failed to understand the warning. When they reached the crossroads at Ardennes, the convoy suddenly found itself facing Panther tanks and SS Panzer Grenadiers. The Panthers destroyed the first and last trucks in the column, trapping all the vehicles in between. The American soldiers were cut down by automatic weapons fire as they leapt from the trucks and tried to escape. They had run into the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Piper, which had finally broken through the front and driven rapidly forward all morning. Throughout the day, Piper's men had already executed dozens of unarmed civilians and prisoners. practices they had become accustomed to on the Eastern Front. The Panzer Grenadiers quickly annihilated the 285th Battalion and captured more than 130 American prisoners, who were marched to a nearby field, stripped of their valuables, and murdered with machine gun fire. 84 American prisoners were killed in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. The news, however, did not sow fear among the Americans fighting in the Ardennes, but rage. U.S. units, which had already been fighting hard, now did so with even greater determination, resolved not to fall into German hands. At St. Vith, General Jones of the 106th Division received the grim news that 2 of his forward regiments had been cut off by the German advance. He was also informed that enemy tanks were only 6 miles behind his lines. Even so, Jones gathered what was left of his division, together with troops from the 7th Armored Division and other retreating units, to form an improvised force defending St. Vith in a horseshoe-shaped perimeter. Their goal was to keep the Germans from capturing that vital road junction for as long as possible. Farther south, Major General Norman Coda of the 28th Infantry Division was taking a brutal pounding. Even so, his men continued to fight ferociously. But despite these acts of bravery, the 28th Infantry Division would be almost destroyed by the end of the offensive's second day. Although the Germans had been held up, the 5th Panzer Army had finally punched a hole in the center, and the road to Bastogne lay open. The 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division were racing toward that strategic crossroads, encountering little resistance. In the north, Kampfgruppe Peiper led the advance of the 6th Panzer Army toward the Meuse, while American units tried to reorganize on the Elsenborn Ridge. Eisenhower understood what was at stake and mobilized every available unit on the front. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had been resting and refitting in Reims when they were alerted to the crisis in the Ardennes. The 82nd Airborne would be sent to the northern shoulder to hold the Elsenborn Ridge, while the 101st would be deployed to Bastogne in the center of the front. Among the men of the 101st were those of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. They were just a small part of the more than 250,000 Allied soldiers now racing toward the Ardennes to try to halt the German offensive. Without question, the speed with which so many men and so much equipment were rushed into that bulge in the front would become one of the greatest logistical achievements of the entire Second World War. At 6:45 on the morning of December 18, 1944, the third day of the Battle of the Bulge, soldiers of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division saw German tanks moving toward their positions on the Elsenborn Ridge. The 600 men of the 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment were under Lieutenant Colonel William D. McKinley. He had been ordered to defend the twin villages of Rocherath and Krinkelt at all costs. His mission was to buy time for a new defensive line to be built behind him, because his battalion was all that stood in the way of the 12th SS Panzer Division breaking through and cutting off the 2nd Infantry Division. The American infantry was outnumbered, but they had one major advantage: their artillery. The Elsenborn Ridge dominated the Ardennes and served as an ideal platform for the U.S. heavy guns. In a 120-minute fire mission, 348 guns fired 5,760 shells in support of the defenders of the twin villages. The 1st Battalion beat off the first attacks thanks to tank destroyers and artillery, but its defensive lines were gradually crushed, one after another. Panthers and Panzer IVs managed to knock out the few M10 tank destroyers and break through the outer defenses. Then they literally drove over the battalion's trenches, crushing them, knocking down walls, and burying the defenders under snow and earth. The American crews of 57mm anti-tank guns fired at the German tanks, only to see their rounds bounce off the armor. The situation became so desperate that McKinley's forward units called down artillery fire on their own positions as they were overrun by the Germans. McKinley eventually received orders to fall back to the new defensive line, but the enemy was already so close that he could barely pull his men out of the fight. Just as the entire battalion was about to be overwhelmed, 4 Sherman tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion appeared to the rescue. The Shermans caught the SS division off guard and quickly destroyed 3 panzers. The German attack finally stalled, and Lieutenant Colonel McKinley's men were able to pull back in good order. Frustrated by so many delays, the commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division committed his reserves. 2 regiments, 1 Volksgrenadier and 1 Panzergrenadier, supported by a fresh battalion with 96 Panthers, 80 mechanized half-tracks, and 12 Jagdpanzer tank destroyers, prepared for the final assault. Facing them were the remnants of the 38th Infantry Regiment, backed by a platoon of Sherman tanks and a platoon of M10 tank destroyers. By mid-afternoon, Panthers and Jagdpanzers rolled into the twin villages, while the American defenders responded with bazookas. The Americans had fortified the houses and carefully concealed the few tanks they had left. The Germans took heavy losses in the narrow streets. More than 30 armored vehicles were destroyed that day by U.S. anti-tank guns. In the end, sheer German numbers told, and the American rear guard was forced to pull back in the afternoon. By the 3rd day of the Ardennes offensive, the situation was critical. The only hope of preventing the panzers from reaching the Meuse and driving on Antwerp now rested on the battered American divisions and improvised units caught up in the offensive. They had to hold out until reinforcements arrived from across the Western Front. Joachim Peiper continued to push forward in the north, looking for bridges that would bring his armored forces closer to the Meuse crossings. He had been forced to deviate from the route Hitler had personally chosen, because some roads were in terrible condition and several bridges could not bear the weight of his massive Königsstiger tanks. His sole objective now was to exploit the gap he had opened and reach the Meuse as quickly as possible. In the morning, Peiper attacked the town of Stavelot, where a company from the U.S. 526th Armored Infantry Battalion had set up an anti-tank roadblock. The Americans were still deploying their men and guns when they were surprised by 2 Panthers and a company of Panzer Grenadiers driving down the road toward the bridge. The defenders managed to knock out the lead Panther, but the tank had gained so much speed coming downhill that it smashed through the anti-tank barrier before it stopped. The second Panther took advantage of the gap and seized the bridge, followed quickly by more Panzers. Because of this lightning move, the Americans failed to blow the bridge, and Peiper's men were 1 step closer to the Meuse. By late morning, the men of the 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment, had withdrawn to a new defensive line higher up on the Elsenborn Ridge. Their stand at Rocherath and Krinkelt had allowed the 2nd Division to rebuild a solid front. But the battalion had lost nearly 70% of its strength in that desperate fight. Units of the 9th Infantry Division moved up to reinforce the line, while the rear guard in the twin villages continued to hold off most of the 12th SS Panzer Division. A column of 7 captured American trucks approached from the southeast toward a battalion of the 99th Infantry Division. A U.S. tank destroyer fired a warning shot over the first truck, forcing it to halt. A patrol moved forward to identify the column. Suddenly, the men in the trucks opened fire on the patrol, and a wave of German soldiers leapt from the vehicles. 140 SS soldiers, wearing their own uniforms, were trying to slip through the American line using captured trucks. However, the U.S. defenders answered with mortar fire and heavy machine guns, and the fight quickly turned into a one-sided slaughter. Roughly 3/4 of the SS men were killed or wounded before the survivors fled in disorder. Meanwhile, Peiper had managed to bring much of his force through Stavelot when his scouts discovered another intact bridge in the village of Trois Ponts. Kampfgruppe Peiper moved quickly to exploit the opportunity. But just as the armored column reached the site, U.S. engineers managed to blow the bridge before the tanks could begin crossing. Despite this setback, they found another bridge at Chanou, captured it, and crossed the river with the column. But, unbeknownst to Piper, an American reconnaissance aircraft had already spotted his force and reported its position. By late afternoon, Piper's scouts found yet another bridge, this one over the Lienne River. At the same time, Piper was at the head of his column crossing the bridge at Chanou when the sky suddenly cleared for a moment. P-47 fighter bombers of the U.S. Air Force swooped down on his exposed column, and Piper ran for cover. The Allied attack aircraft, nicknamed Jabos by the Germans, pounded Kampfgruppe Piper, while flak-Vierling anti-aircraft guns tried to drive them off. When the raid was over, 2 Panthers and about 10 vehicles had been destroyed, and Piper's advance was delayed yet again. Eager to make up lost time, the lead vehicle in the column rushed toward the newly discovered bridge and was just about to cross when it exploded in front of them. U.S. engineers, alerted by the P-47's attack, had blown the charges. In desperation, Piper sent a tank company north to try the last remaining bridge in the area. But as the Panthers approached it, they came under intense anti-tank fire. After barely beating back the ambush, the German crews discovered, to their dismay, that the bridge was not strong enough to support their tanks. With no usable bridges left on that route, Piper was forced to turn his entire column around and go back to where he had started that day. At the same time, units of the 82nd Airborne and other American forces were arriving to block his advance to the west and counterattack the overextended German forces. Several kilometers farther south, the situation for the Americans was far worse. The Panzerlehr and 2nd Panzer Divisions had been advancing all day toward Bastogne, where the first elements of the 101st Airborne Division and the 10th Armored Division were only just arriving. Brigadier General McAuliffe and Colonel William Roberts received orders from General Troy Middleton, commander of 8th Corps, to get their units to the front as quickly as possible. To buy time and allow the new troops to deploy, Middleton sent the Combat Command R, Rose, and Combat Command H, Harper, of the 9th Armored Division to cover the main roads leading into Bastogne from the east. They were to establish 2 roadblocks northeast of the village of Longueville and hold out as long as they could. Combat Command Rose was about to be hit by the heavy tanks of the 2nd Panzer Division, supported by an artillery regiment from a Volksgrenadier Division. They had already repelled 2 probing attacks, but now the bulk of the German armor was bearing down on them. At nightfall, Rose's roadblock was the first to engage. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Harper commanded the 2nd roadblock, 3 miles to the rear, and soon learned that the 1st was on the brink of being overrun. He asked for permission to move forward and help Rose, but his request was denied. All he could do was listen helplessly over the radio as his comrades at the forward position were destroyed. Harper's men, for their part, had set up a textbook anti-tank defense. The infantry had laid mines on the road, and a 57mm anti-tank gun was positioned on high ground to cover any advance. The Shermans and half-tracks, together with entrenched infantry, formed a horseshoe-shaped perimeter around the crossroads. 17 Sherman tanks and a small number of infantrymen were about to face the full weight of the 2nd Panzer Division. Soon, Harper's position was probed by German infantry moving ahead of the tanks. His Shermans and infantrymen managed to repel these first assaults, which still lacked armored support. But the main force was not far behind. Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Stu-G assault guns entered the fight. Instead of attacking straight up the mined road, the Panzers stayed at range and used their superior firepower to pick off the American tanks. In the darkness, they used the burning Shermans and half-tracks as beacons, spotting the silhouettes of other vehicles against the flames and destroying them one by one. Seeing how desperate the situation had become, Harper ordered the rest of his men to fall back toward Longueville without him. He took his small reserve of Sherman tanks and led a brave counterattack against the panzers, determined to give his retreating troops the best possible chance to escape. All of the American tanks were destroyed, and Lieutenant Colonel Harper was killed in the charge. Even so, his sacrifice had meaning. The German advance was delayed yet again, and the race for Bastogne was being decided hour by hour. The German spearhead reached the outskirts of Bastogne, only to find that Longueville and the village of Neffe were already occupied by the first elements of the 101st Airborne Division and the 10th Armored Division. On December 19th, the men of Kampfgruppe Piper prepared to resume their advance after the previous day's setbacks. They attacked and captured the village of Stoumont, ready to try once more to push toward the Meuse. But Piper was stunned to learn that an American counterattack had retaken Stavelot and cut off his spearhead. He had no choice but to wheel his entire force around yet again to recapture Stavelot and reopen his supply lines. In the center, the 422nd and 423rd Regiments of the 106th Division had been surrounded since the second day of the offensive. With ammunition and food nearly gone, both regiments surrendered. Almost 8,000 American soldiers were taken prisoner, the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in Europe. On the northern shoulder, Kampfgruppe Piper's ordeal continued. His men had managed to take Stavelot back and restore their supply line, but they had lost the entire afternoon they had hoped to use to drive west. After dark, American soldiers from the 105th Engineer Battalion, led by Captain Leland Kofod, infiltrated the village and moved toward the main bridge over the Amblève River. There, they stacked between 20 and 50 50-pound TNT boxes in a pile just beneath the first span. As they were finishing, a German sentry spotted them, and machine gun and tank fire raked the bridge. Kofod led his men as they sprinted off the structure and scattered for cover. The captain detonated the explosives, blowing a huge gap in the span. A large part of Piper's column was now trapped on the far side of the Amblève. That night, enraged SS troops executed 23 civilians. During the day in Verdun, Dwight Eisenhower presided over a war council. His attention was focused on Bastogne, which was rapidly becoming the focal point of the entire German offensive. Eisenhower wanted to redirect General George Patton's Third Army, then in the south, to attack northward and relieve the pressure on the town. Patton, however, had already secretly prepared just such a move, and his lead units were already driving north. Night fell on December 19th, the date by which, according to the German plan, the panzers should have been rolling into Antwerp. But American resistance, bad roads, and snow had all conspired to slow the offensive. To make matters worse, the Wehrmacht was burning fuel at twice the expected rate, and its armored formations had still not broken out of the difficult, wooded terrain of the Ardennes. Even so, one last effort might still bring them to the Meuse before Allied reinforcements could fully engage. In Bastogne, the men of Easy Company finally disembarked and moved toward their assigned sector near the small village of Foy. As they marched through Bastogne, they passed columns of defeated, shell-shocked American soldiers trudging toward the rear. They were just staggering along, Captain Dick Winters later recalled. It was pathetic. We felt ashamed. His men, as sharp as ever, took the opportunity to strip any extra ammunition from those retreating troops. As the paratroopers took their places on the line and began digging foxholes, they heard the unmistakable crackle of small arms fire. The battle for the villages of Longueville and Neffe had begun. On the morning of December 20th, 1944, the fifth day of the offensive, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of Commonwealth forces in Europe, received a call from Dwight Eisenhower at his headquarters in Brussels. Eisenhower had decided to place the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, holding the northern shoulder of the Ardennes under Montgomery's command. Eisenhower turned to Montgomery at a critical moment. The Ardennes offensive had been underway for 5 days, and American troops were straining to hold off powerful German armored forces. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army continued to attack the worn-down 1st, 2nd, and 99th Infantry Divisions holding the Elsenborn Ridge. In the south, the German 7th Army had barely advanced, lacking enough tanks. In the center, Bastogne had become the main objective of the German drive and was under tremendous pressure. The 101st Airborne Division, together with Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, was trying to hold off the 5th Panzer Army almost on its own. If the Wehrmacht took Bastogne, it would control the 7 main roads in the area. On the outskirts of Bastogne, a mixed force of about 400 paratroopers and troops from the 10th Armored Division had been desperately defending the village of Noville for the past 36 hours. This improvised force was known as Team de Sobry, after its commander, Major William de Sobry, and it had been fighting the 2nd Panzer Division, which was trying to break through to Bastogne. De Sobry had already been wounded and captured when a German flanking attack seized the village of Foy, behind the American position. Seeing that Team de Sobry was isolated and almost out of ammunition, General McAuliffe ordered Colonel Robert Sink, commander of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, to organize a rescue mission to get them out. The 3rd Battalion, 506th, emerged from the woods west of Foy and cleared the village before noon, forcing the Germans to withdraw and reopening the road to the north. Fortunately, the fog settled over the area just as the half-tracks moved toward the ruins of Noville to relieve the trapped garrison. With the escape route open, Team de Sobry prepared to withdraw, loading their wounded onto any vehicle still running. As the column pulled out of Noville, American engineers blew the church steeple, which crashed down and blocked the main road through the town. Team de Sobry and the paratroopers of the 506th managed to evacuate, most of the infantrymen running alongside the vehicles. The column pushed on toward the southwest, trying to reach friendly lines, when disaster struck. Just before entering Foy, an extra armor plate on the lead half-track came loose and slid down over the windshield, blocking the driver's view. He slammed on the brakes, and the 15 Shermans and half-tracks behind collided with each other. A massive traffic jam formed at the worst possible moment. At that very instant, 3 German panzers appeared on the line of hills to the east. They took full advantage of the stationary column and opened fire, causing devastating damage. They destroyed 11 Shermans by hitting them in the flanks, where they were most vulnerable. The valley glowed orange from the burning vehicles as the Americans tried to return fire. Just when the rescue was about to turn into a massacre, a group of paratroopers climbed aboard a Sherman whose crew had abandoned it in the chaos. Although they had no training as tankers, they managed to swing the turret around toward the panzers and fire. Under pressure, they even figured out how to reload the gun and keep shooting. These paratroopers, turned into makeshift tank crews, succeeded in destroying one of the panzers and forcing the other 2 to retreat. With the German tank threat under control, the survivors of the column struggled forward through the thick fog to reach American lines. When they finally returned to position south of Foy, Colonel Sink was waiting by the roadside, shaking the hand of every man who passed. In nearly 2 days of fighting for Noville, Team de Sobry had lost more than half its strength. But it had kept the 2nd Panzer Division from taking Bastogne from the north. The fighting in and around Noville would have unforeseen consequences for the German offensive. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, was convinced that the American garrison at Bastogne could be defeated by infantry alone. He therefore ordered his 3 panzer divisions to bypass the town and continue west without stopping to attack it directly. With the timetable for reaching the Meuse already badly delayed, Bayerlein did not want his armored forces tied down in a siege. The 26th Volksgrenadier and 5th Fallschirmjäger divisions prepared to encircle and besiege the town. For Montgomery, the top priority was to prevent the Germans from crossing the Meuse. Although intelligence had initially failed, the Allied High Command now had a much clearer idea of the enemy's intentions. It was impossible to ignore the columns of Panthers moving toward the river. Montgomery sent the British XXX Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, to secure the Meuse bridges and position British tanks and artillery at key crossing points, ready to stop the German offensive. Meanwhile, the 6th Panzer Army continued to launch desperate assaults on the American positions along the Elsenborn Ridge. That dominating high ground had become an insurmountable barrier to the German drive toward the Meuse, and time was running out before large Allied reinforcements arrived. At nightfall on December 20th, the 12th SS Panzer Division made one last attempt to break the American line. They managed to punch a hole in the right flank of the 1st Infantry Division, but the success was short-lived. The attack was quickly halted and thrown back when the 82nd Airborne and other units arrived to stabilize the front. The German High Command now clearly saw that the 6th Panzer Army had failed to achieve a breakthrough on the northern shoulder. Attention shifted fully to the battle for St. Vith, which was reaching its climax. There, a mixed force of badly battered units had managed to deny the Germans control of that key road junction for nearly a week. But the defenders were starting to buckle under the tremendous pressure from the 5th Panzer Army, which launched 21 attacks on December 20th alone. Major Donald Boyer of the 38th Armored Infantry Battalion, 7th Armored Division, felt that his unit could not hold much longer. His men had been fighting almost continuously since the offensive began. They were exhausted and nearly out of ammunition. On the morning of December 21st, Boyer's troops were hit by Volksgrenadier, who launched a massive infantry assault, hurling grenades and firing Panzerfausts as they advanced on the American positions. Facing annihilation, Boyer called for a danger close artillery mission, with shells landing just 50 yards in front of his lines. The artillery batteries carried out a time-on-target mission to support Boyer's men. This tactic involved shells of different calibers striking the target area simultaneously, carefully coordinated by the artillery command. The gunners calculated firing data and synchronized their watches. As the soldiers of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division sprinted across the clearing in the woods, a massive rain of shells fell on them. 105 and 155 mm howitzer rounds, along with heavy mortars, exploded just 50 yards in front of Boyer's position. The precise barrage created a devastating scene of destruction and death among the Germans. Just 2 minutes passed between Boyer's call for fire and the first impacts. Even so, he knew this was only a brief respite, and that, with no reserves and artillery ammunition nearly gone, it would be impossible to keep stopping German attacks. In the north, Kampfgruppe Peiper had been cut off from its supplies for 2 days and was slowly being squeezed into a pocket. At Stavelot, 100 of his men tried to swim across the icy Amblev waters to safety, but American riflemen shot them down one by one. Only 20 survived what would later be called the duck shoot on the Amblev, and Peiper pulled the remnants of his force back to the village of L'Église. There, they were attacked by the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. Its commander, General Bill Simpson, encouraged his men to be ruthless with those responsible for the Malmedy massacre. He was even proud when he learned that the Germans had nicknamed his division Roosevelt's Butchers. At St. Vith, the Germans began their final attempt to crush the salient. Nebelwerfer multiple rocket launchers, nicknamed Screaming Mimes by the GIs, pounded the woods around Boyer's position, shredding trees and hurling splinters everywhere. Each Nebelwerfer could fire 6 150mm explosive rockets out to about 6.4 kilometers. Unlike Soviet Katyushas, these rockets were spin-stabilized rather than fin-stabilized, which improved accuracy. Even so, they were still less precise than conventional artillery and were used mainly to saturate an area with explosives. When the bombardment ended, Panthers and Stu-G assault guns, supported by infantry, attacked Boyer's position. The American infantry opened fire again, but their anti-tank rounds could not penetrate the armor. Then, a brave soldier grabbed a bazooka and sprinted across the battlefield toward the nearest Panther. He pressed the bazooka tube directly against the tank's armor and pulled the trigger. The explosion knocked out the powerful vehicle, but it also killed the young soldier. The desperate battle for St. Vith continued as heavy snow began to fall. The American units holding the salient finally started to give way under the offensive. By around 8 p.m., the 18th and 62nd Volksgrenadier Divisions had broken the perimeter in several places. Even so, the remnants of the 7th Armored Division and Combat Command B of the 9th Division were still clinging to their positions. However, those 20,000 men ran a serious risk of being completely encircled if they did not withdraw soon. Around 5 p.m., 6 Tiger Warrant tanks from the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion, supported by Volksgrenadier, attacked American positions on the Schönberg Road east of St. Vith. Following German combined arms doctrine, the Tigers advanced after an artillery preparation intended to silence the American defenses. Although the Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, German discipline and training were no longer what they had been at the start of the war. As the Tigers moved forward, German artillery laid down smoke screens and high explosive shells on both sides of the tanks to shield their advance. With the route secured, the Tigers fired high explosive rounds into the American front line to disorient the defenders. Then their crews quickly switched to armor-piercing shells and began knocking out Shermans and tank destroyers using a shoot-and-advance tactic. 4 Tigers split into pairs. One advanced while the other covered it with fire. Then they switched roles, creeping closer to the defensive line and rolling over the barbed wire so that the Volksgrenadier could follow in support. By the end of the fight, every American vehicle had been destroyed, and the surviving U.S. soldiers were retreating toward the town with the Germans right on their heels. The 38th Armored Infantry Battalion was also in dire straits. 2 Panthers managed to punch a hole near their position and fired directly into the American gun crews. Although there were no Shermans or tank destroyers left in the sector, Boyer's men managed to drive the tanks back by throwing grenades onto their tracks. Field Marshal Montgomery and the American commanders in the area decided to abandon the St. Vith salient, convinced that the defenders had already accomplished their mission by delaying the German advance. Montgomery wanted to reorganize the defensive line farther west before those forces were destroyed, but the order came too late for Boyer's men. Of the 670 soldiers he had at the start of the battle, only 185 remained. Boyer ordered them to split into groups of 5 and try to break out on their own. Many would not make it, including Boyer himself, who was captured and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. 2 German Volksgrenadier divisions marched into St. Vith and immediately began looting the houses, most of which were already empty. It did not take long for American artillery to begin raining down on the shattered town streets. The situation had been reversed. Now, it was the Germans who had to defend St. Vith to keep their supply lines open. With the fall of St. Vith, Bastogne became the last American stronghold in the center of the German offensive. By the afternoon of December 21st, all 7 roads leading into the town had been cut. The American defenders of Bastogne were surrounded. General von Luttwitz was counting on the infantry he had left behind to clean out the Bastogne pocket, while his panzers raced for the Meuse. The German tanks would soon need Bastogne's road network to bring supplies forward for the expected drive toward the river. Meanwhile, the Allies were preparing their response. In the north, the German advance had been stopped cold, though at a terrible cost. The British Sachs-Cossacks Corps was moving toward the Meuse to contain the main German penetration in the center. In the south, General Patton was eager to launch his counteroffensive to relieve Bastogne, but bad weather was slowing the Third Army's movements. Above all, the Allied High Command was desperate for the skies to clear so they could finally unleash their massive air power, which had been largely grounded since the offensive began. The men trapped in Bastogne could only wait, either for someone to come and free them, or for the weather to improve enough to allow supply drops from the air. Ammunition and medical supplies were running desperately short. The 101st Airborne's field hospital had been destroyed in the fighting around the perimeter. The snowstorm that began in earnest that day would grow even heavier during the night. The hard battle for Bastogne was about to begin. But that is another story.